What's up, guys? My name is Michael Sigler, and this is my new channel, Automotive Obscura. I also have automotiveobscura.com, which I will put like a written version of this on. The general idea is I am a huge car nerd, and I have been for a very long time. And so I wanted a place to just talk about weird cars. Just the unusual, the weird option packages, the obscure, the things that no one's heard of or no one really remembers. Just weird cars, basically. That's pretty much my whole deal. So today, in my very first episode, I'm going to talk about a very obscure and weird car, the GM EV1. It was GM's first modern attempt at a battery electric vehicle. And it was developed in the early to mid 90s and came out originally as a 1997 model. So it's a pretty weird unit. The whole story is kind of just bizarre overall. So I don't know exactly how this is going to go. I haven't really nailed down my format yet. So for this one, I'm just kind of reading along the article. I'm not going to just sit here and read the article to you, but I am using my article for my website that I've already written is kind of a guide to remember what points to hit and in what order. That might change, but for now I'm going to try that for the first episode, see how that goes. So the EV1 was, as I said, arguably the first modern battery electric vehicle. It came out in 1997, which predates the Tesla Roadster by like 11 years, the Model S by 15 years. So this was like quite a way back, and battery technology and EV technology, number one, totally wasn't where it is now, but number two, a lot of the stuff in modern EVs actually originated. GM engineers had to actually come up with a lot of this stuff because it didn't really exist until then. So it really all started at the LA Auto Show in January of 1990. General Motors had a show car there called the GM Impact. And it was, when you look at the picture, it pretty much looks like the EV1. It's very clearly the basis for this. Feedback and response from both, the general public and like everyone at large was largely positive to the GM Impact, to the point that they thought it was feasible to build a production car. Leadership thought it was good. Everyone seemed to like it. So in April of 1990, the then chairman of GM, Roger Smith, announced that they would build the Impact. They didn't actually build the Impact, but they did build the EV1, which is pretty much identical. Production began in 1996 for the 97 model year. It's a two-seat, two-door coupe. The electric induction motor was rated at 137 horsepower, 110 pound-feet of torque, and it drove the front wheels. The first-gen cars had lead-acid batteries, and using the current 1999 EPA rating procedure, it was rated at 78 miles. If you use the newer 2019 rating procedure, that falls to 55 miles. This was also the first vehicle to ever be just a GM. Obviously General Motors makes a bunch of cars, but none of them up until now had ever been called a GM model. It was, a Chevrolet or a Buick or a Pontiac or an Oldsmobile or a Cadillac, but never just a GM. But this was actually a GM EV1, so that's kind of interesting. The cars were actually not for sale. You had to lease them, and the lease actually stipulated that there was no purchase cost. At the end of the lease, you couldn't be like, cool, I want to keep it. There was no option for that. Only thing you were guaranteed is you got the car for the term of your lease. At first, they were only available in, I believe, the LA area and Phoenix, Arizona. The lease cost between $399 and $549 a month, which was actually fairly expensive in the mid to late 90s. Not crazy money, but it wasn't cheap, They launched it in late 2000. In late 1996, they did a big press tour, got celebrities out there, and they did events where they signed up some leases and stuff like that. Deliveries actually began on December 5th, 1996, which, as I'm recording this, December 5th is tomorrow. So, hey, pretty timely. In total, the first gen, they made 660 first gen cars. For the 1999 model year, the EV1 was pretty substantially revised. It still looks the same to me, to the point that honestly, I can't tell the difference between a first and a second gen. I'm sure there are some subtle differences, but since the cars aren't around anymore, which I will get to, I've never learned them. But they look very much the same, although they were apparently significantly lighter. And the very first of the second gen, the first like production run of the second gen, also came with lead acid batteries, but they had a capacity of 18.7 kilowatt hours. The first gen battery pack's capacity was 16.3 kilowatt hours, so they got a little bit of a bump. Later in the second gen, they switched to nickel metal hydride batteries with a capacity of 26.4 kilowatt hours. The nickel metal hydride batteries boosted the range up to 142 miles using the 1999 rating system. Second gen sold 457 EV1s, so that brings the total of both to 1117 total cars. They were weird looking units. The interior will definitely look familiar to you if you were around in the mid 90s and inside of a General Motors vehicle. It totally reminds me of my 94 Z28 that I had in the late 90s. I'm pretty sure like half of the parts in the picture of the interior were parts bin GM parts, the turn signal stalks, the AC outlet vents. The radio looks very similar, but you will notice that there's a bunch of buttons down on the console. Apparently you typed in a code to start the car instead of turning a key, so that's kind of novel. I've also got a shot of the cluster here, the gauges. This very much reminds me of like early Prius. It's got the range, battery charge, and digital speedometer and trip meter and odometer. I actually included a picture of my 2009 Prius's dash, which has pretty much the same general layout and the same like big old school LCD, like digital speedometer right in the middle. So that's kind of cool. On the outside, it basically looked like a Saturn, which makes sense. These were sold in service through Saturn dealerships. You can definitely tell that there are a lot of concessions to improving coefficient of drag. The car has like the skirts over the rear wheels, and looking at the roof line and the rear deck, how it like kind of swoops down, kind of like comes together like a boat tail. Definitely was function over form. Apparently they got the coefficient of drag down to 0.19, which is pretty amazing. Not really any modern cars have that low an coefficient of drag, so that's pretty cool. I cannot tell you how they drive because they are no longer around to be driven, but I did find an old Car and Driver article. The original test was in their March of 1997 issue. They took the car, did their regular instrumented testing on it, and then they did some range testing and stuff. Pretty interesting read. There's a link to it, and I'll also put a link down in the description. They did 0 to 60 in 8.4 seconds and a quarter mile at 16.7 at 79 miles per hour, because it was speed limited to 80 miles an hour. So I'm guessing, the limiter on the car was slightly off compared to the actual like radar on the track, and it was just topped out. That's honestly not terrible for this era. It's about what like a similar era like Cavalier does in terms of 0 to 60 in quarter mile. So it was like not a sports car. Like, don't get me wrong, there were faster cars in the mid 90s than this, but for like an economy car, which this is really was aiming to replace, the performance was totally fine. And I'm sure like it was probably more fun to drive than a Cavalier, because if you've ever driven an EV, you know that they make instant torque, and this one was no exception. No gears, instant torque. It probably felt peppier around town than a similar Cavalier, So not terrible. It also had a button on the shifter, just like a modern EV, to where you could toggle between like basically one pedal mode if you want the really aggressive regenerative braking, or if you want it to act like a combustion engine vehicle and just coast down. So that's pretty cool. Let's see, what else? It is kind of cool to read their reactions to it because it still applies to basically everyone when they first drive an EV, talking about how they like the fact that it's quiet, it's convenient to plug in at your house and leave every day with a full charge, but then the things they didn't like are still common concerns of people with EVs, like basically range anxiety, like will this be enough? And it's funny, they were talking about the charging infrastructure being completely non-existent, which is definitely different in LA now, but is still like a common concern of people that where am I going to charge this thing, especially if you don't live in like a single family home where you can just have like a level 2 charger in your garage. So you should definitely check out the Car and Driver article because it's kind of interesting to look at now, 20 years later, basically. Let's see. So the reason that this car is so rare and the reason that no one has heard of it is because on February 7th, 2002, GM Advanced Technologies Vehicles brand manager Ken Stewart notified leaseholders that GM would be removing the cars from the road. In other words, they're not renewing the lease anymore. You can't buy them. They're taking them all back. In 2003, the EV1 program was officially canceled. There would be no successor to it. There would be no EV2. They cited the inability to make electric cars financially viable. In other words, like they just weren't making money on it, or at least that's what GM says. Like I said, no option to purchase it, no extending the lease. In November of 2003, GM began taking the cars back from the leaseholders. 40 of them were deactivated to where they would no longer work and then given to like museums and colleges and stuff. Or I guess museums is kind of self-explanatory, but I read something that said the colleges could use their technology department to take them apart and see how they were built, which I guess kind of makes sense because, as I mentioned, I'm going to link an article also that's really cool about the way that they were designed and built from like the GM engineering team that built this. But as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the things that we kind of take for granted if you have a hybrid or an EV, especially like a plug-in hybrid, they actually had to invent for this car because it didn't exist. Regenerative braking is one of them. Heat pump air conditioning and heating is another one that like the resistive heat just completely destroyed the battery, as it honestly still does on cars that use resistive heat on like plug-in hybrids or electrics, like the first gen for sure, Chevrolet Volt. I think the second gen as well. Like they used resistive heating and your range would just like drop. So this one, they came up with the heat pump system, which is what some of the newer and nicer EVs use today. So they had to invent a lot of this stuff. So I guess that kind of makes sense that they gave them to colleges to take apart and check it out, but still, whatever. But the majority of these cars were just straight up crushed. There was actually people protesting. They had to have like police escorts for the cars that they picked up because people were, freaking out that their perfectly good electric car that required no gasoline was being taken away and crushed. It was a whole thing. So why did GM do this? Well, they say it was just like a straight up financial decision that they did not make enough money on them. But then again, I don't know, that kind of rings hollow because you wouldn't really expect to make a lot of money on a car like this. This is more a future bet. The reasons that I think they did not want to make that future bet come down to something more political than just straight business. See, when they announced that they were actually building the EV1, the California Air Resources Board, or CARB as they are commonly called, decided that they would then mandate that a certain percentage of every car maker that wants to sell cars in California, a certain percentage of their cars be zero emissions by a certain year. And like the percentage went up as the years went on. I think it was like 2% by 2000 or 2003 or something. It goes up from there. And GM did not want to do that and did not want to be mandated to do that and didn't want to lose out on basically all the money that they had put into research for like internal combustion engines and stuff. So a lot of people feel that GM kind of sandbagged it and was like, see, we tried, it doesn't make money. You can't make us lose money, in order to be able to take that as evidence to the CARB board to be able to like fight against their mandate for zero emissions vehicles comprising a certain amount of the fleet. They actually did go to federal court over this, and obviously the California Air Resources Board had to reverse that decision because obviously 5% of all cars in 2005 or whatever were not battery electric, zero emissions cars. So I guess it kind of worked. But then again, it's kind of frustrating to think of how far ahead GM could have been in the current environment where electric cars are becoming more and more popular and the technology's kind of caught up to the point where they're totally viable. If they would have stuck with this program and kept improving it, they would have had a huge head start over everybody. And electric cars would probably be a lot more, common now and ubiquitous and probably just straight up better with another decade of research from a giant multi-billion-dollar corporation behind it. But that's not what happened. There is actually a feature film about this whole debacle called Who Killed the Electric Car. I'll throw a link to that down there. And that's basically it for this episode. Just a weird unit, a weird looking car, a weird story, a weird method of sales, a weird taking it back from people and crushing them all, like just a really weird unit. So I think that's it for this episode. I've got some further reading I'm going to link, and I definitely, if you've ever listened to the podcast Syntax, I definitely did not get this idea from there. But every week I'm going to pick something at the end of the show, just something cool that I've bought recently or something I've found. It might be a service, it might be a product. Just I'm gonna call it Sig's Pick because I'm Sig. So this week I found a pretty cool garage light bulb. It's like this giant thing that looks like an octopus or something, screws into a regular bulb base, and that's got all these like petals on the side of it like a flower, and they have LEDs on them so you can angle them around. So the idea is you've got like one regular bulb socket in your garage, and you can screw this in and then angle the little petals around to where it lights up your garage, and it's super bright. I picked one up on Amazon. It is ridiculously bright. I can see every corner of my garage now, which really just reminds me that I need to clean it out. But I can see everything in it. Looks awesome. So I will drop a link to the hell is this thing called? It's one of those Amazon brands. It's just a collection of letters. Like, I think they just use like a random letter generator and put them together. This is Onfo, ONFFO. But whatever. They probably all came out of the same factory and they're just rebranded by different ones. But yeah, if your garage is not bright enough, you should definitely check one of those out. And let me know what you think of like this format. Is there anything I should change? Is there something I should do differently in terms of the video or the written word version? And what cars would you like to see me talk about? Okay, I think that's all for now.